Hey guys, so if you've been through my opening repertoire as black video, that you'll know that my kind of catch-all response to unusual openings when you're playing with the black pieces, when white plays something that isn't e4 or d4, that quite often my general fallback would be to play the reverse London system. This makes even more sense if you like to play the London system as white, because you get to play basically your opening with all the same kind of patterns and typical threats and combinations and stuff as black as well as white, and there's very few times when you can really do that. So I've just played a game where I play the reverse London because my opponent's rated mid 800s, okay? Now, they started with knight to c3, which is unusual, okay? So I thought, well, let's go ahead, let's do the reverse London, so I play d5. Okay, and then a3 is played, so this is quite an unusual opening for me, but the great thing about the London is that you can usually knock out your first 10 or so moves without too much interference from your opponent. Okay, so let's see how this plays out in the game. So then d4 is played, so okay, so then I play e6. So what I'm doing is I'm building this pyramid, and it's because I'm black, it's on the light coloured squares, but first I've got my light coloured bishop out of that pawn structure. Okay, e3 is played, so he's kind of mirroring my pawn structure to a degree, although he's got a knight on c3. I play c6, and now I've completed my pyramid. He brings his knight out to f3, bishop to d6, and this is exactly the mirror image of what you would play as white. Okay, and the next two moves usually are in whatever order to bring your knights out to here and here. There is another option, which is to delay bringing out your king's knight, and sometimes you can push the f-pawn forward and then bring the knight behind the pawn, which is what I end up doing in the game. Okay, so he brings his light square bishop out in front of the queen. This is a very common motif in the London, and the classical response is to drop your bishop back to the g-file, and then if this bishop comes out and takes, remember he's already used one move to develop this bishop, so he'll be a little maybe behind on his own development if he decides to exchange it. So the idea is, yeah, if the bishop takes, then you recapture with the h-pawn, giving you a semi-open h-file. Then if your opponent castles kingside, that can help in your attack. As it happens, white decided not to enter into the exchange, and instead moved his knight back round to f2. So this is something that does happen fairly frequently, with the idea of bringing your knight maybe to g3 and creating a very solid kind of fortress for the king. I bring my knight in front of the queen, which is the very typical London move. c4 is played, and then I decide to play f5 so that I can put my... so I'm basically starting my pawn advance on the king side. Clearly, white isn't going to want to put his king here, because there's so much space around, he's already pushed too many pawns forward. Okay, so he's going to be castling kingside for sure. So I figure that I'm better off getting my pawn advance started now, because I may think about castling queenside myself, and then I'll want to do a pawn storm and get my pawns up the board. So I figure getting the f-pawn forwards now, it also shuts down the opportunities for this light square bishop to some extent, potentially. And then the idea is to put my knight on f6 behind the pawn. Okay, he takes with the c-pawn. I capture back with my c-pawn. I figure having this open file is absolutely fine. And I want to have more pawn pressure on this side of the board if that's where his king is going to be. He brings his bishop out, pins my knight against the king. I decide to kick the bishop with a6, and then again with b5. This is a very common pattern. When you find a bishop comes out with that pin, kicking the bishop away with either one pawn or the double pawn combo is very, very common. The question is, when is it a good idea to do it and when is it not a good idea to do it? And I figure that in this situation, this is absolutely fine. I want this bishop to be lined up on one of these diagonals where it's staring into my light squared pawn structure. I don't want to keep this pin live. So I figured I'm much happier with the bishop back there. Then I move my rook across to the completely open C file. Now what I'm thinking about all this time, I have to say, is a common attack that I like to put together with the London system is to use this bishop, which is the one that's been in my pyramid, okay, and in combination with the queen. So quite often, for example, I might think, drop the bishop back to b8, put my queen on c7, then if white castles and puts his king there, all I have to do is get rid of this knight, and then my queen can come in with a beautiful checkmate, okay? Whether it's mate in 1 or mate in 2, all right? So that's my general plan at this point in the game. White pushes a4, and I decide that I'm better off pushing with my b-pawn rather than going in for the exchange. I don't want to take and allow this bishop back onto this pinning diagonal. Absolutely don't want that. So I push with the b-pawn. The idea is that at some point I'll follow up with a5, reinforce that pawn. It's already protected by the bishop. White prevents that by pushing a5 himself. Then I develop my remaining knight. My knight has got a nice square here on e4 where it can go at some point. And the bishop comes back because that pawn has now moved away. So I castle away from trouble, and white advances his knight to e5. So there's a slight error here in that putting his knight on that square means it is on a square where it's attacked by 2 pieces and defended by only 1. Which means if I initiate an exchange here and he recaptures, then I win a pawn. So I grab with a knight, pawn recaptures, I grab with a bishop, I'm now a pawn up. Very, 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 very basic tactics, right? If I put my piece there, how many defenders has it got? How many attackers has it got? Now f4 is played, kicking my bishop away, and this is annoying because it's creating a dark square blockade in the way of my queen and bishop idea, so that's less likely to work. So I move my bishop back to d6 where it is defending this pawn. I think another option could have been c7 with the idea of maybe attacking that, but my queen is actually looking at that pawn, so I am thinking about capturing this pawn at some point. He brings his other knight forwards. Now clearly here he's got a potential attack, so this knight's looking at the e6 square, and if he gets on the e6 square, then he's got a nice fork against my queen and my rook, so he's going to win more material, so I can't allow that. I bring my light square bishop back to f7 to guard that square. This is my vulnerable square, it's a backwards pawn, it's protecting both of these, so it's like the root or the anchor of my light square pawn structure just in the centre of the board there. Bishop comes out to d2, looking at this pawn. This pawn is defended once, so I don't have to respond to that. So then I bring my knight in, staring at his d2 bishop that's just moved there, and he moves his rook across to c1 to challenge my rook on the open c file. I decide I'm not really interested in the exchange right now, shove my rook over to b8, and then white castles. Now at this point it's now looking like maybe this f4 move, which if you go back, all it achieved was kicking this bishop away, right? But is the bishop a huge threat there? I don't know. But it's starting to look like this f4 move, if now that he castles on that side, may become a vulnerability at some point. So knight comes in, protect, and then he castles. Okay. Then I decide to dive in with my queen and grab that pawn. This pawn is now protected twice, so there's no real danger. There's no pawn that can come and threaten it. So I figure I can just jump in with my queen and if I need to, I can just jump straight back to d8. But what I missed is this, a fork. And again, this is another weird move by my opponent. So I thought for a while here, and I decided to move my queen back to b6, anticipating that he's going to grab the rook and win material, and I can then recapture either with the queen or the bishop. But for some reason, my opponent doesn't grab the material, and instead decides to save his bishop from an equal exchange on the other end of the board. So I very, very gladly move my rook out of the way. White moves his knight out of the way. Yes, my rook is under attack by his rook, but it can be defended by its partner. So then I play e5. Now, the computer actually said this was a blunder, I believe. But I kind of like this move because strategically, yes, I'm happy to hit the knight, but also I want to break up these two pawns here to open up channels towards his king. You know, I've got two bishops on the board, I've got my queen, you know. So I figured that strategically it kind of made sense. What it does do, and this is the reason why the computer called it a blunder, is that it left f5 undefended, knight comes in and grabs that. I then grab the pawn on f4, and now this is interesting because what that means is I've got rid of that pawn that was in my way, but also this pawn here on e3 is now pinned. It's in an absolute pin. The pawn cannot legally move because it would put the king in check, and you're not allowed to do that. So this pawn is pinned, right? Cannot move, cannot capture there. So I've got ideas. I could capture the pawn or whatever. The knight's also looking at this bishop, remember. So the knight grabs the bishop, and then I recapture with my knight. I had two options. I could have recaptured with the knight or with the queen. But if I'd recaptured with the queen, then it would have broken this pin on this pawn here on e3, right? And I wanted to keep that, I wanted to keep the tension, I want to keep the pressure on my opponent. So I recapture with the knight. The knight can always go straight back to e4 if it wants to. He then grabs the loose pawn with his rook, opening himself up to a fork with the queen, as you can see. Queen captures e3, forking the king and the rook. Now the correct move here, I think is pretty obvious, would be rook to f2, protecting the rook, because the rook would now be protected by the king and the bishop. But for some reason, and how long did my opponent, let's just check how long my opponent took over that move. 29 seconds, actually thought for 29 seconds over this, and then made the completely wrong move, allowing me to grab the rook. So now I'm a couple of pawns and a rook in front in material. And now we start to go towards the endgame. For some reason he brings his rook forwards. Yes, it's defended, but look, I'm 7 material points in front. I've got 2 rooks to his 1. Why offer exchanges at this time? There's absolutely no need to do that. Then I bring my bishop over to h5, attacking the queen. Oh no, my bishop, you may be thinking. Okay, here, can't the queen just grab the bishop? Well, no, it can't. The queen captures the bishop there. I capture his bishop on f2 with check. The only legal move for the king is to retreat to h1, and then my queen comes into f1, checkmate. Okay, so white does well. He spots that threat and comes in with a counter strike of his own. Queen to d5 check, forces my king into the corner to h8. Now I'm thinking about back rank tactics, right? I've got my rook on the f-file, which is good. Now, if I were able to get my queen onto the back rank, so this is one pattern that you need to get into the habit of doing, okay? If I can get my queen onto the back rank, there's nowhere for his king to go, okay? His king will be in check and cannot move out of check. So the only option when the king's in check, if it can't get out of check itself, is to block. So what you need to do is you need to look at all your opponent's pieces and how can they block on the back rank, okay? And here we've got a situation where the queen can only get to d1, and the bishop can only get to e1. And because those are different squares, if my queen goes there to c1, it doesn't matter what he does. He can block with the bishop, I take it, checkmate, right? Or queen there, he can block with a queen, I take it, block with a bishop, I take it, checkmate. Okay, very, very common pattern. That's one that you need to store in your head. Okay, so white decides to create an escape square, has to give up his bishop. He's now well behind in material. However, if this queen can ever grab that rook, I could find myself on the receiving end of a surprise back rank mate as well. So I've got to tread very carefully. Although I'm up in material, white has enough material to do a forced mate if I slip up. So I've got to choose my moves carefully here. Okay, king goes to h2, queen captures the pawn on h4 with check, king's only got one move, queen comes back to e1 check, king goes back to h2 again. Now I come in with my rook, and I calculated this, right? I thought for 40 seconds on this move. Okay, so the clear threat is rook to h1, which would be checkmate, because the queen is guarding this square, the rook is guarding the entire h-file, and that's it. So that would be checkmate. So that's the threat. Now I figured out, what can white do? Is there a surprise retaliation? No. If the queen goes to g1, king captures, winning the game. If the queen captures the knight, then I can go ahead with my checkmate. So I figured this out first, very carefully. He's got to push his pawn to prevent the checkmate. Rook to f2, king has to move, another check, and king again only has one square, and then my rook comes in, again the king only has one square, and then queen comes in to f6, and that actually is checkmate. So a pretty tidy finish in the end. I didn't get to try out my original or implement my original attacking idea, but that's the thing, you have to modify your ideas as the game progresses, and in the end it was a comfortable victory, helped by the fact that my opponent did blunder that rook in the middle game. So just try and remember this general structure for your pieces, and then the knights coming out. The London structure works really, really well as black as well. So I do recommend the London system. The London system is took me on from 1000 to 1200, 1300 playing as white and as black as well. So if it's something you're into, let me know. We could do one or more videos on the London system as white as well. But I hope this has been useful and interesting for you. I hope you've picked up a few tips. I'll see you next time.